African American Studies from UCLA, a master's in history from Johns Hopkins University, where he is currently a doctoral candidate. Dunlap's activism is also a driving force behind his scholarly pursuits. He's contributed to major research projects such as archiving the age of mass incarceration with the $1 Million Hoods Project and the Ralph J. Bunche Center California Reparations Task Force research team at UCLA. He was also named a UCLA College Magazine Changemaker for Justice and Equity. His participation in speaking engagements and organizational efforts at forums, regional conferences, and community and university events across the country highlight the historical accounts of the Black liberation movement, race, class, and various struggles for political and economic power. His work as a labor organizer leading strikes in Chicago, Los Angeles, and Greenville, South Carolina is a testament to his commitment. Currently a PhD candidate in the history department at Johns Hopkins University, Dunlap's research focuses on the history of Black political movements and thought in the broader context of political and economic trends throughout the United States and its history. Please join me in welcoming Broderick Dunlap.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, it's an honor and a privilege to be here with you all. Thank you so much, Dr. Gutierrez-Romine, for that introduction. And, before I get started, in honor of Research Week, I kind of wanted to take a little bit of time to talk about the trajectory of my research and how it's evolved from undergrad to where I am now and working on my dissertation. Just one moment so I can share my screen. So I'm a non-traditional student, and proudly so, honestly. And I like to say that I took a 4-year summer break, but during that time, I never stopped learning. As Dr. Gutierrez kind of talked about in my bio, I've been a community organizer for quite some time. And while I was out of school, I became involved in union organizing and community organizing. And that was profoundly influential in my intellectual interest. So when I finally decided to come back to school, most of my interest was studying like political movements of people that fought back against injustice and oppression. So my senior thesis was about the origins of the Black Panther Party and the Brown Berets. I argued that because they were founded in California, one in Oakland and one in Los Angeles, that this was evidence that California may not be the liberal bastion that it, kind of proclaims to be, and this really inclusive place for diverse communities. Rather, it was this testing ground for repressing and criminalizing the most marginalized and vulnerable amid, rapid demographic shifts. So as I did that, I really kind of fell in love with the process of research. I had the opportunity to be Dr. Gutierrez's research assistant my last summer in undergrad, and we went to UCLA's Charles Young Archive, and that was a really transformative moment for me. I thought it was really fascinating that you can kind of see and touch history rather than seeing it in books. And I was like, I want to do this for a living. So, she kind of helped me get into with the process of getting into grad school. And so I got into UCLA's African American Studies program, and I also graduated 3 months before the pandemic. And there wasn't a whole lot you could do. So I continued to read. I did a lot of reading, kind of trying to be prepared for grad school. And I came across this book by Dr. Edward Onachi, Free the Land, which was about the Republic of New Africa. And this was this separatist organization, a Black nationalist organization that concluded that due to the endemic racism in the United States, the extreme violence and discrimination, that equality was impossible in the United States, and they felt that they should begin to develop their independent political and economic institutions and infrastructure that serve the needs for working class African Americans. And I had never heard of this movement, and I was kind of shocked that I didn't know, because they were founded around only a couple years after the Black Panthers were, and they continue to exist today with particularly the Malcolm X grassroots movement, current community organization that's across the country, primarily on the East Coast. So I attended a book talk for Dr. Onachi, where he was talking about the book and the trajectory of Black studies. And he talked about some topics that he really hoped that young scholars would kind of pick up and really engage with seriously. And he mentioned reparations. He said that reparations was criminally understudied. And for some reason that stuck with me, I think largely because it was in the news, reparations was on the ballot in California. So I began to revisit the Black Panthers and see if they mentioned reparations at all. And sure enough, in their 10-point program, reparations is right there clear as day. And I recognize I was one of those people that was kind of, glossing over reparations as a political demand. And this kind of sent me down a rabbit hole of like looking, and then I slowly realized that reparations was everywhere in the Black Power movement, and even prior to that, in just about every significant Black-led movement in the United States, there's a demand somewhere for reparations. So, as I, got into UCLA and I was working on my master's thesis, I decided to write about the long history of reparations and, its really radical and transformative roots, that it was more than about writing a check and just, sending Black people on their way, but these were demands that they viewed as being transformative to society for the United States to be able to live up to the rhetoric that it portrayed, that it was for equality, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. And they wanted to transform society to where it was equitable for all people. I drew the conclusion that, amid the kind of moderate reforms that were being articulated by the contemporary reparations movement, that maybe we should look at get back to our roots and look at these radical demands that were more than small business loans, but really autonomous, self-efficient communities, and that the potential of reparations was so much more than what we were kind of articulating at the moment. Um, so one of the most prominent organizations and people in this movement was Queen Mother Audley Moore. She's the woman at the bottom right of your screen. She lived to be in her late 90s, but she was a community activist for about 70 years. And she was incredibly influential to the reparations movement. She should be credited for kind of reviving the reparations movement, because after the decades immediately following emancipation, the reparations movement died down a bit. And she was also just influential to Black radical thought, not just the reparations movement. She was a mentor to Malcolm X and to Muhammad Ahmad, formerly known as Max Stanford. He was the founder of the Revolutionary Action Movement, also known as RAM. And RAM was the only secular organization that Malcolm X joined after he left the Nation of Islam, and before he founded the Organization of African American Unity. And then that RAM was one of the first organizations that Huey Newton and Bobby Seale engaged with before they decided to establish the Black Panther Party for self-defense. So Queen Mother Moore, whether directly or indirectly, was profoundly influential to just Black radical thought, particularly in the latter half of the 20th century. So I really wanted to examine her work, and then also, and she's considered the mother of reparations. And then I came across the father of reparations, who is Imari Abubakari Obadeli. He is the gentleman in the bottom left hand of your corner. He wrote this book, The Foundations of the Black Nation, and he came out with this really extensive policy proposal for reparations, what to do with the money and the resources, and how exactly it would end, discrimination and, foster self-sufficiency within Black communities across the country. So after I wrote my master's thesis, I went to Johns Hopkins, where I still am, and my advisors have really pushed me to kind of put these movements in their proper context. And so some questions that have really helped me kind of gain more clarity in my research questions, and how I draw my conclusions and my overall analysis, are these 5 sets of questions. And they really, for undergrads that are interested in kind of going into grad school and a career as a scholar, these questions could really be helpful for the work that you do in the future. And the first one is, what political and economic developments created the material conditions in the United States during the 1980s? Nothing happens spontaneously. There are always external forces that kind of push things like to a head. And for me, it's the political and economic developments that create the social conditions. And then how did the general public, particularly working class African Americans, respond to these conditions? And then the next question was, what strategies were used? And what impact, if any, did these responses and strategies have on the material conditions? Some strategies work better than others, as we'll kind of talk about in my talk. It's important to kind of parse that out. And then through that, we can ask, what can we learn? Is there anything from this history, these particular movements or people that we can learn either positively or negatively, like we don't want to do this, we don't want to return to this, or this is something that we should, kind of revisit and bring with us going forward. So I really became interested in the 1980s because during my undergrad research, I kind of learned about, Ronald Reagan and he was apathetic at best towards working class and poor African Americans and just working class and poor communities in general. And then he was particularly hostile to leftist and progressive political frameworks. So my logic was after reading so much on, Black political movements in the 60s and 70s, it seems like the historiography kind of just doesn't really, hasn't got to the point where they're really engaging with the 80s. And for me, my thinking was if Black people resisted slavery, they definitely resisted Reagan. So I began to kind of look at who was active during the 80s, and sure enough, it was the New African Independence Movement. So now that I've kind of given you the spiel of how my research interests have evolved and changed over time, let's delve into a transformative, yet often understated period in American history, the landscape of Black politics during the 1980s. This decade, frequently overshadowed by the ascendance of conservative ideologies under President Ronald Reagan and the entrenchment of neoliberalism, was far from a monolithic era of political latency within Black communities. Instead, I will argue that the 1980s were a dynamic period marked by significant adaptation and persistent resistance from radical and progressive Black movements. To truly appreciate the nuances of this era, we must first acknowledge that the foundational impact of the civil rights and Black power movements of the mid-20th century. These movements fundamentally altered the American consciousness and legal frameworks concerning race. However, the promise of full equality remains largely unfulfilled, with racial discrimination and economic exploitation persisting, particularly within the criminal justice system. The ongoing struggle reflected in the 21st century movement for Black lives serves as a poignant reminder of the enduring nature of this fight. 2020 was a particularly eye-opening experience in this struggle. The ascension of the author of the '94 crime bill and one of the chief architects of mass incarceration, Joe Biden, the self-proclaimed top cop, Kamala Harris, to the White House suggests that this contemporary movement was not nearly as impactful or as effective as preceding Black freedom movements. And in this slide, despite rhetoric from more conservative people, the demands for defunding have remained largely ignored, and police killings continue to increase year over year. Contemporary movements, political strategies, and demands often differ significantly from their mid-20th century predecessors. I suggest that there has been a crucial shift. Contemporary movements frequently advocate for more moderate concessions within the existing system rather than building independent political organizations and institutions. This is exemplified in Black Lives Matter's decentralized organizational structure, which advocates for body cams and community oversight, which we see has had a nominal, if any, effect on curbing police violence. This begs the critical question: what precipitated this evolution in the political demands of Black freedom movements? I argue that the legacy of McCarthyism, and more significantly, the state-sanctioned repression carried out by the FBI's COINTELPRO, which directly targeted leftist leaders within the Black Power movement, played a decisive role in delegitimizing radical political ideas within mainstream discourse. The FBI outlined their political objective explicitly, quote, "The Negro youth and moderate must be made to understand that if they succumb to revolutionary teaching, they will be dead revolutionaries," end quote. However, these objectives were not exclusively reserved for African Americans, and the state conveyed the same message to other colonized groups within the United States, particularly Native Americans and Puerto Ricans. This ideological war against progressive politics extended well into the 1980s, where not only radical but even liberal frameworks advocating for a robust safety net were demonized as handouts. Consequently, Black-led political movements facing this constricted ideological space often gravitated towards more moderate stances, frequently embracing market-oriented solutions and emphasizing individual responsibility as a means to address systemic issues. This shift aligned with the broader neoliberal turn of the 1980s under Ronald Reagan, where the market increasingly became the prescribed panacea for Black oppression. As liberal lawmakers themselves adopted more conservative positions on social safety nets and criminal justice to maintain political power, progressive and radical political ideas and figures found themselves increasingly marginalized within formal politics. Many scholars suggest that the sabotage of Black power under COINTELPRO resulted in the end of leftist politics. However, history tells us that Black radical and progressive movements existed before and after Black power. And the movements and campaigns featured in this talk suggest something other than an end to those kind of politics. The reality is that the political terrain was transformed as more Black elected officials ascended to power than at any other point in American history. As a result, leftists increasingly began to view electoral politics as a viable means to achieve their political objectives, which diverged from the anti-establishment sentiments held by several radical Black power and New Left movements of preceding decades. This was a significant shift after the social reforms of the Civil Rights Movement. Previously, Black political leaders had to appeal almost exclusively to white liberal elites and rely on their often fickle goodwill for resources and political power. However, ratifying the Civil Rights Act of 1964 brought about a new generation of elected Black political leaders, creating tension amongst the grassroots political leaders of civil rights and Black power and the elected officials in formal politics. This struggle between the old and new guard was over legitimacy and who would lead in this new era as Black political power expanded. Amid Reagan's crusade for austerity, a widening class divide within African American communities during the 1980s made a unified and coherent populist political movement increasingly difficult. Black politicians developed policies that primarily focus on the needs and concerns of a new, upwardly mobile Black middle class, leaving large swaths of African Americans behind in the broader political economy. However, the dominant historical narrative often overlooks the fact that progressive and radical political movements continued to flourish after the decline of Black power and well into the 1980s. This project seeks to illuminate how these movements navigated this dramatically shifting landscape. The 1980s marked a significant transition from a legally sanctioned apartheid state towards an ostensibly colorblind neoliberal model. This new paradigm emphasized individual responsibility and market-based solutions for racial uplift, often conflating Black power with Black capitalism. This ideological shift was underpinned by harmful, gendered stereotypes that demonized poor Black women as welfare queens and Black men as human predators. Reagan revived early 20th century rhetoric where public lynchings were the norm to demonize urban Black youth. These stereotypes provided a convenient moral justification for the drastic slashing of social welfare programs and shifting the blame for declining material conditions in working class communities from systemic failures to individual shortcomings. This evolving landscape compelled left-leaning movements to fundamentally adapt and alter their organizing methods. The movements of the 80s did not pop up spontaneously. Instead, they were the continuation of previous protest movements, particularly Black Power. The rise of Black Power coincided with a crisis in the global capitalist economy. Internationally, former colonial superpowers had to adjust to a quickly decolonizing world as several former colonies began to try and map out the best way forward for economic development, which often contradicted Western corporate interests. In addition to declining economic conditions domestically and abroad, the police in the US became increasingly militarized and hostile to the poor and working class. Black nationalist activists began to portray law enforcement as a foreign occupying army in Black neighborhoods because they were often white with no connection to the communities they patrolled. This is exemplified in the formation of SWAT teams, whose first deployment was against the Black Panther Party for self-defense in Los Angeles. As poor working class African Americans became increasingly alienated, rebellions became more frequent. Historically, in the United States, riots were the product of white hostility to shifting demographics due to emancipation and the integration of predominantly white neighborhoods. It wasn't until the 1960s and 70s that urban rebellion happened in response to same-sex violence and economic underdevelopment. Internal colonialism was used as a conceptual framework to identify the persistent colonial political and economic practices and institutions that shape Black life and their relationships with American political and economic structures, particularly relationships with the land, labor markets, and the law. This framework also helped them conclude that the police function more like an occupying military rather than a public service in Black communities. In addition to tracking shifting political trends during the Neoliberal Turn, this project will take seriously the assertion made by radical activists and scholars during the Black Power era that Black people in the United States exist as an internal colony. The goal of doing so is to reveal the limitations of solely relying on the apparatuses of liberal democracy and market-oriented solutions to address social problems as the only legitimate strategies for ending Black oppression and exploitation. In this context, wealth, health, and education disparities are not simply social deficiencies that require simple reforms. Instead, these so-called disparities are constitutive elements in the American political economy that require more transformative measures. Taking up the domestic colonialism argument as an analytical framework to reveal the continuities from America's colonial past can inspire a return to demands for power and developing alternative economic and political institutions and infrastructure that benefit the working class majority. The state declared war in response to urban rebellion and the crisis of capitalism. The gains won during the civil rights movement caused a reactionary pivot to the right within formal politics, with a growing disdain for poor urban communities due to the rise of urban rebellions. Rather than address the root causes of urban rebellion, the state criminalized poverty, political dissent, and addiction, and invested in the infrastructure that transformed crime and punishment into a lucrative industry. This led to legislation based on stereotypical assumptions about Black people, crime, and the working class, further perpetuating negative perceptions. The domestic wars declared on the radical and poor was a bipartisan effort and was initiated in 1965 by Lyndon B. Johnson's Wars on Crime and Poverty and bookended by Richard Nixon's declaration of the war on drugs in 1971, which did not reach its climax until Clinton's Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of '94, also known as the Crime Bill. Analyzing this series of legislation that ostensibly sought to address several social disparities through an internal colonialism framework leads one to conclude that these various wars on poverty, crime, and drugs were indeed actual hot wars against the most vulnerable populations within the US as a method to repress rebellion and criminalize poverty and addiction. Now, by the 1980s, Capitalism was in crisis again, and the United States was experiencing the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression. By Reagan's inauguration in 1981, the United States was an empire in transition and crisis. The American economy transitioned from manufacturing to service-based, desperate for foreign investment, as unemployment jumped to approximately 7.5%, which is more than double what is the general acceptable level. However, Black power no longer dominated political discourse among African Americans. Ronald Reagan's election solidified neoliberalism as the dominant economic and political order. The consequences of this new economic landscape in highly industrialized and developed economies were higher unemployment, lower economic growth, and higher inflation, which necessitated capitalist restructuring. The Republican chair of the United States during this time on civil rights, Arthur Fletcher, asserted that Reagan attempted to, quote, colorize the working class population to move to more dramatic structural changes and gain more support for his plans for deregulation and slashing safety nets. Through Reagan's use of racially neutral dog whistle language, white workers eventually embodied what the ideal image of the American working class was. This move made it easier to ignore and view other groups as less deserving of legal protections in the workplace. Reagan's austerity measures against big government primarily manifested in slashing of public sector jobs, the primary vehicle through which African Americans could reap the benefits of the civil rights era policies and achieve upward mobility economically because of the endemic racism still prevalent in the private sector. Government jobs were vital for Black workers from 1960 to 1976. Over 50% of job growth was in the public sector. In addition to Reagan rolling back social services and deregulating markets, he strong-armed workers to work by undermining labor strikes and decertifying the Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organization, which emboldened employees to adopt anti-union business practices, contributing to a sharp decline in union membership and political influence. All of these measures disproportionately negatively impacted working-class African Americans. So one of the most notable responses to this new landscape was the adaptation, and the adaptation to this landscape was the increasing prevalence of coalitions, forging alliances between radical leftists, Black nationalists, and progressive liberal politicians. The emergence of the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America, also known as NCOBRA, in 1987 stands as a powerful example of this trend. The politically diverse coalition united around the shared demand for reparations for the descendants of enslaved Africans. In 1989, through the efforts of NCOBRA and with the support of Congressman John Conyers, the Commission to Study and Develop Reparations Proposals for African Americans Act was presented to the House of Representatives. While the bill ultimately did not pass, its very introduction to the halls of power signifies the continued vitality and influence of progressive Black-led movements during a decade often characterized by rising conservatism. The member organizations within NCOBRA were actively engaged in a broad spectrum of causes and issues, including fervent anti-apartheid activism, advocating for liberation of political prisoners, and the pursuit of equitable political representation at all levels of government. The formation of NCOBRA in September 1987 was primarily initiated by Imari Obadeli, the president of the Republic of New Africa. He aimed to cultivate solidarity for African liberation struggles, particularly South Africa, but also across the diaspora, and to develop a cohesive and definitive campaign for reparations. In a strategic move to foster unity across diverse political and ideological lines, NCOBRA made the conscious decision to prioritize the fundamental right to reparations without advocating for any specific form or model of redress. Initially, NCOBRA coalesced to seek reparations for descendants of enslaved Africans in the United States and the preceding British colonies, but eventually grew to have chapters in London and Ghana. Reparations were not simply viewed as a way to close the racial wealth gap and other social disparities. In the face of all-out war, reparations were a battle cry to radically transform the political, economic, and social order that facilitated the oppression and exploitation of all people. I am personally, I'm not interested in arguing for or against reparations. This project will primarily analyze the methods and political frameworks they use to organize a movement that stretched across 3 continents in the African diaspora and what caused these organizations to come together. As liberal elites moved towards more conservative stances to maintain their hold on formal political power after the civil rights and Black Power eras, the relationship between these elites and Black-led political campaigns became increasingly strained, often marked by contradictory political agendas. And in addition to austerity, neoliberal economics, and mass criminalization, state repression of progressive and radical movements placed significant barriers on their ability to achieve their political objectives. The experiences of Harold Washington, Chicago's first Black mayor, poignantly illustrate this inherent tension. Despite running on a progressive platform that aimed at significant wealth redistribution to address the pressing needs of marginalized communities and being incredibly popular in the city, Washington faced fierce opposition from his fellow liberals in the infamous city council wars, a period when 29 of the 50 aldermen in Chicago, all Democrats, 28 white, and 1 Hispanic, formed a coalition that approved the city budget but blocked all of Washington's policy proposals and appointments for 3 of his 4 years in office. This opposition stemmed mainly from the prevailing austerity measures and reluctance of established liberal elites to embrace truly transformative economic policies out of fear of losing political power to their Republican counterparts. Yet, despite all of this, as a lifelong activist, Washington maintained close ties with grassroots organizations such as the National Black United Front, a member organization of NCOBRA, highlighting the enduring significance of informal political networks and community organizing. Washington, as a product of the civil rights movement, was keenly aware of the pressing concerns of marginalized communities, and his attempts to address them are apparent in his political agenda, which also included creating jobs with livable wages, addressing a growing housing crisis in the city, and improving the quality of public education. Inspired by Washington's successful grassroots mobilization in Chicago in 1983, civil rights veteran Jesse Jackson sought to replicate this model on a national scale during his presidential campaign in 1984 and 88. In his first campaign, Jackson earned just over 3 million votes and won 5 states in the Democratic Party. He more than doubled his results in 1988, earning nearly 7 million votes. Jackson's progressive platform, advocating for issues ranging from a free and sovereign Palestine and the condemnation of South African apartheid to universal health care and reparations for the descendants of enslaved Africans, directly reflected the needs and concerns of poor and working class Black folks, who the neoliberal turn had largely left behind. While his bids for the presidency ultimately fell short and had many shortcomings, Jackson's campaigns represent a significant national level effort to resist the prevailing conservative agenda and to push for a more just and equitable society. His platform aimed to, quote, renegotiate the relationship between the Democratic Party and the poor and those left out, end quote. Jackson's foray into electoral politics does not necessarily represent a concession of progressivism. However, it is difficult to negotiate with a hegemonic institution like the Democratic Party without anything to leverage. And perhaps there should have been a protest movement that supported his campaign, similar to the strategies deployed by Harold Washington. Harold Washington's campaign was unique because he was a reluctant candidate conscripted by Black Chicagoans who had organized a movement prior to his campaign to achieve full political representation and elect the city's first Black mayor. Washington's ties to grassroots political movements were apparent throughout his time as mayor. Aside from his redistributive economic policies, he established a subcommittee that addressed the demands made by Chicago City to divest from apartheid South Africa. The anti-apartheid movement is where formal politics and mass protest movements collided nationally, arguably the most impactful since the civil rights and Black Power eras. Beyond formal electoral politics, the anti-apartheid movement provides a compelling case study of the powerful synergy between formal and informal political action. This movement within the United States sought to isolate and weaken the racist South African regime and witnessed increased support from African Americans during the 80s, building upon decades of prior struggle both within South Africa and in Britain. Trans Africa, an organization founded by the Congressional Black Caucus in 1977, which is described as a foreign policy advocacy organization designed to force attention on issues concerning Africa and the Caribbean, played a pivotal role in mobilizing mass opposition to the United States' continued support of apartheid. The Free South Africa movement, a powerful coalition forged between the CBC and student and community activists in 1984, employed diverse tactics, including advocating for robust economic sanctions and organizing widespread mass demonstrations to pressure corporations, universities, and major banks to divest from South Africa. This movement is evidence of a profound commitment to an internationalist political outlook, actively opposing racism, colonialism, and discrimination, not only within the United States, but across the globe. The movement also reveals the complicated relationships between nationalists, leftists, and liberal politicians as activists leverage the power of the American empire to achieve their goal. I am interested in how, if at all, they reconcile the contradiction of using the power of an empire to topple a colonial regime. The movements in South Africa and the US learn from each other. Several parallels exist between the Black consciousness movement led by Steve Biko and Black Power organizations. Additionally, the iconic figure of South African freedom fighter Nelson Mandela further galvanized movements of advocating for the freedom of political prisoners, both in South Africa and within the United States. The domestic wars declared by the state in the 60s and 70s, including COINTELPRO, in response to urban rebellion, were still active in the 80s. In an address to the United Nations Commission on Human Rights, activists representing American political prisoners pointed out that countries all over the world were releasing their political prisoners, including the Soviet Union, Cuba, and South Africa. What's known as the Freedom Now Coalition organized an international tribunal with 10 respected jurists and human rights activists and urged the United Nations to send representatives to their tribunal as a part of an independent investigation into the existence of political prisoners within the United States and the human rights abuses they suffered while incarcerated. These activists saw amnesty for all political prisoners being held in American prisons and the freedom for them to engage in the political activities for which they were prosecuted, free of harassment or surveillance. The opportunity to present their case to the United Nations suggests that Freedom Now campaign was an influential force in the movement to free political prisoners in the United States. However, they were not the only influential voice in this movement. The New African Independence movement activists were a powerful force in the political prisoner movement as well, forming the New African Prisoners Organization, the New African Peoples Organization known as NAPO, and the Crossroads Network. These organizations created several publications, Vita Wawatu and the New African Prisoners of War publications. These publications were an outlet that allowed incarcerated New African activists to theorize the function of the American criminal justice system and how it was used as a tool of political repression to share their lived experiences while in prison. It was also a place, these publications were also a place to share their art, whether visual, poetry, or short stories. And they also drafted policy proposals for prison reform. The New African Independence Movement emerged as a particularly vocal and influential advocate for political prisoners, indigenous South African sovereignty, equitable political representation, and reparations. Rooted in a unique syncretic political ideology known as New African Political Science, organizations operating within the New African Independence Movement, most notably the Republic of New Africa and NAPO, actively engaged in grassroots protest movements and eventually ventured into the realm of formal electoral politics. Furthermore, the New African Independence Movement played a central and foundational role in the burgeoning campaign for reparations for the descendants of enslaved Africans in the late 20th century. Their multifaceted activities underscore a continued and unwavering commitment to fundamentally transformative political frameworks to achieve a radically democratic society. The active participation of organizations such as the RNA, NAPO, and the National Black United Front within the NCOBRA coalition vividly reflects the salient political concerns of working class African Americans during the 1980s in particular. And that diverse array of strategies they employed to pursue their political objectives amid the neoliberal turn. These concerns were included, but were not limited to equitable political representation in power domestically, anti-colonialism abroad, and the rapidly ballooning prison industrial complex, and economic equity through reparations. In conclusion, the 1980s, while undeniably shaped by the rising tide of neoliberalism and conservatism, were far from a period of political dormancy within Black communities. In the realm of Black politics, the 1980s were a pivotal time that required a widespread adjustment in how to engage with the larger American political economy, as Jim Crow was now dead, but white supremacy was alive and well. I hope this talk reveals Black radical and progressive movements' continued vitality, adaptability, and commitment to struggle during this pivotal decade. The efforts in the formal political arena carried out by Jackson and Washington reveal a strategic response to the neoliberal turn and an attempt to stake a claim in a country headed in a new direction in the post-civil rights era. Their challenges reveal the growing divide in class interests and political concerns between upwardly mobile, middle class, and poor African Americans. While liberal elites often neglected to address the needs and concerns of poor and working class African Americans in formal electoral politics, their voice remained a prominent one in informal political spaces. The powerful international solidarity demonstrated by the anti-apartheid movement, the persistent struggle for political prisoners led by organizations in the New African Independence Movement, and the broad coalition building exemplified by NCOBRA in the fight for reparations, we witness a resilient and multifaceted resistance to the neoliberal turn. These movements, with their diverse strategies, unwavering commitment to transformative change, and deep understanding of the interconnectedness of racial and economic justice, offer invaluable insights into the ongoing fight for liberation in the face of persistent systemic changes. Thank you. And here are some of my sources that I've used for this talk.
Thank you so much for that that presentation, Broderick. I was taking notes as you were talking, and so I will probably come up with a question or two, but I'd like to open it up first. Does anyone in the chat, or would anyone like to raise their hand and ask a question first?
I don't have a question, but I just wanted to say, like, so well spoken. Like, it was so easy to connect the dots, and the way that you were just able to speak on all of these topics, like, so seamlessly. Wow.
Thank
Thank you.
you. Yeah.
Ash, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to echo that statement. I thought it was such a wonderful presentation and on something that I definitely didn't have as much knowledge about. I'll turn my camera on. Yeah, I thought it was really fascinating. And especially because I feel like there's such a lack of knowledge about these organizations and what they were doing in these topics. What were your methods for like collecting this information? about these organizations.
So you want to know how I like found my primary sources or the topic? Is that the question?
Yes.
So yeah, I came across just kind of like naturally going through the historiography of Black freedom movements. And then after I read, I talked about it in the beginning of the talk that came across Edward Onachi's Free the Land. And I hadn't really never heard of the Republic of New Africa up until that point. And so that kind of just sent me down this rabbit hole. I looked at the sources that were in his bibliography in the back of the book and like looked at the text that I thought might be relevant to the questions that I had after I read it, and then went kind of followed down that path, and then that's how I came across the Republic of New Africa and Imari Obadele's work, The Foundations of a Black Nation. And then it just kind of snowballed. Some of the archives that I've gone to, particularly like the Freedom Archive up in Berkeley. They have a bunch of like really fascinating primary sources that are accessible. They're free and they're mostly digitized. You can download like unlimited downloads from the Freedom Archives, and they have so many things from so many movements that we've unfortunately never heard of.
Thank you.
Thank you for that question, Ash. Dr. Keating, go ahead.
Broderick, thanks so much for your talk. I really enjoyed it, and it was very enlightening. So I want to ask you a question, not necessarily directly related to your talk, but maybe something that you can share, with the students here that are listening, and tell us about sort of the role that mentors have played in your journey, and how I'm assuming that they have in some way, right? Because mentors have played an important role, I think, in many of our experiences, but how they've supported you and directed you and gotten you to where you are today, if you don't mind.
Yeah, yeah, I have a lot to say, especially about Dr. Gutierrez Roman. She was like, I would not have gotten to grad school if it was not for her help. That's how I feel like she helped me, really sharpen my analysis and asked me like challenging questions when I was working on my senior thesis, helped me clean up my writing, which needed a lot of work, probably still does need a lot of work. And so as far as like her help, like there's so many ways that she helped me just kind of can get started in grad school. And then I've had several advisors. I had a few at UCLA, and I have a couple here at Johns Hopkins. And really it's them like being able to have someone that can correct you in like the most safe space. They've been like encouraging. Um, yeah, I think that particularly my current advisor, Dr. Minka Makalani, has helped me with conceptual clarity. It's not enough to just say like, I see this connection, but you have to really draw out and like explain how you see these connections so that you can really have like a bulletproof argument. Nobody's argument is perfect, but just to try and make it as strong as possible. So that is kind of how I came upon these questions. It's like, when I told him I wanted to work on this topic, he was like, well, you have to consider the external forces of what are people responding to. People are not just making these movements just because racism is bad. They're responding to like a specific set of circumstances, and you have to identify those, and then that will provide and give you a lot more context for why they're making the decisions they make, or what campaigns they participate in, and how they fashion themselves outwardly, and how they organize internally. So him like really making that emphasis on conceptual clarity and just being clear, and it's like really trying to make things connect the dots as best as I can is something that he's really helped me with as well.
Thank you. I have a couple questions in the chat. I see your hands, so let me do two from the in-person and then two from the chat, and then we'll go back and forth so we can keep track of the text. So the first question in chat is from Melinda. Thank you so much for your presentation. Can you clarify when Malcolm X left the Nation of Islam, and then did he remain Muslim or did his religious views change?
the exact year he left the Nation of Islam is escaping me. I'm sorry about that. But he did remain Muslim. He just left the Nation of Islam mostly for political reasons. Elijah Muhammad was exposed as being predatory towards young women, and he viewed that as hypocritical of what the Nation of Islam's values were. He challenged them, and he was kind of silenced for that, as well as making comments after John F. Kennedy was assassinated, which the Nation of Islam was was trying to avoid being a political organization, and he was becoming more outwardly political, so that led to that break. I don't believe his religious views changed. He made the Hajj in Saudi Arabia to Mecca, but it was mostly his political views changed, and he adopted a more Pan-African orientation.
And then the next question in the chat was, what was the most prolific piece of information you found while researching your topic?
Oh, man. I think there's two. The Foundations of a Black Nation by Mario Bedelli. Other than it just being like a great piece of like intellectual labor, what I really gained from that is like these organizations that so many activists laud were drafting like really rigorous and thorough policy proposals to try and address the needs and concerns of working class people. And that's something that I really tried to take with me as an organizer, because I think it's really just kind of transformed like how I view like organizing and like engaging with the community politically. And then also just the work of Queen Mother Audley Moore. Ashley Farmer at University of Texas is coming out with a memoir, and I can't wait because I think the fact that she doesn't have 100 biographies and works on her is a crime. Like she is prolific, a prolific thinker and organizer. So those two pieces for sure.
Great. So there's still more in the chat, but we'll come back to that. Let's get some of the in-person ones. John Epps, go ahead.
First and foremost, I want to thank you for a really well done presentation and your research. I think it was really spot on. I lived through almost everything you talked about, but I was on the East Coast. And so the one thing I'd like to see is a little more inclusion in your story from that side of the country, because there was a lot going on in parallel to what you were talking about. But I thought what you talked about was spot on. And I think your tribute just a moment ago points to one of the things I think about, which is there are a lot of kind of more senior folks like myself who I think can contribute to the content of what you are talking about, having been there, done that, as they used to say. So I really think leaning into that generation and getting some of their perspective. And there are a lot of people here in San Bernardino. Francis Grice was one, people who were instrumental in how a lot of this movement moved forward. So I just wanted to, again, give you kudos. I thought some of this had died out. So it's good to hear someone really bring it up, and I wanted to just say thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your comments. I do intend to talk about the East Coast a little bit. I just tried to have, because like you said, there is so much going on in the 80s, particularly in the East Coast. I just tried to keep some kind of regional focus, but I likely will venture out to the East Coast, particularly Washington, D.C., because there was a lot going on out this way too. Thank you for that.
Angela, go ahead.
Oh, hi. Hello.
Oh, hey.
How are you?
How you doing?
I'm doing really good. It's thanks for the talk. It's really amazing.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So, your points about the idea of reparations needing to be more transformative to the society, like how do you transform an empire? I'm wondering if you have any interest in commenting on some of the governmental efforts to address reparations. Like I'm thinking of the California reparations bill. Do you have any comments around that, or ideas?
Yeah, I was on the research team for that bill,
Oh,
and
cool.
yeah, so I have a lot of thoughts. I think that like if I were to just simplify it, it's like we're not asking for enough. We're not demanding enough. It should be a lot more comprehensive. I think there's a little bit of overemphasis on, entrepreneurship, which is nothing wrong with that, but there just needs to be, like more attention to working class people, strengthen unions, get rid of the three strikes laws. There's so many other ways that we could go that are kind of tangible and like reasonable steps that we can take to get in our more transformative political objectives and kind of ease the conditions now, expand the social safety net, strengthen those that will primarily help not just Black folks, but working class people, especially with an impending recession. Like, these are things that would benefit the working class majority. And I think that should really be emphasized. Like, it's not like if Black folks, one of the most vulnerable communities in the country, have their most pressing concerns met, that's going to address the concerns of just about everyone. So I think really emphasizing that would, get us a lot further than where we have been with that bill for the last 5 years.
Cool. Thank you. Yeah. Do you, basically, it's like, do you think that it's something I should support? Is there a way to support these kinds of efforts to transform?
To be honest, I mean, I haven't lived in California for like 3 years now, so I
Oh,
haven't
okay.
really been keeping up with the reparations bills. I would say, yeah, support reparations if you would like, but I'm just not familiar with what's going on right now.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Christian, you had a question in the chat, but your hand is also raised now. So why don't you go ahead and go ahead?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and go ahead. Thanks, Broderick. Thank you for the presentation. So I got a question related to like the current state of like informing of demands that sort of follow from like this neoliberal framework.
Mhm.
And particularly, we see, for example, like in mobilizations like the hands-off ones, like this past weekend, uh, the move to like nonprofits generally as a model for mass organizing and like just lessons to draw from like these movements historically in order to like develop like coherent organizing strategies to build anti-colonial movements like within this country.
Um, I'm sorry. What exactly is your question?
I guess like so like the historical lessons of like this and like what we can see in like I guess the neoliberal influence about over a lot of like mass movement like today and also like the informing of the politics of it.
Mhm. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I think for for me, I think it is we need to further engage with the broader political economy. We have to understand like what I think. Just this is just like my guiding question for just understanding the world is like what are the political and economic developments that are leading to this issue that I'm worried about, and like what do I gain from this? Like, how do I, by understanding like these developments, it'll provide more clarity. And then also like understanding, like that'll help understand like the power dynamics at play. And just, and then as I said during my talk, we have to recognize that these disparities, racial disparities, health disparities, wealth disparities are this country was built on like exploitation and like theft. So like these disparities are constitutive elements within the broader American political economy. Like it just doesn't it cannot exist without like these significant gaps between the people that own everything and the people that work for everything. So you have to really build movements and independent institutions and economic infrastructure that challenge those rather than trying to make change from within. We need like institutions that really address the needs of the working class rather than asking, the people that own everything, can you give us, some resources?
That help, Christian?
Yeah, thank you.
Let's see. In the chat, there is a comment from Tamara Holder. I learned so very much today. Thank you. You connected many dots for me on that. I think I think that for a lot of people too, myself included, I'll mention mine in a minute. You connected so many dots for me that though I lived through many of the eras your work covers, I was not aware of much of the material you covered. So that was from Tamara. And then there is a question from Chantel. Great talk. I learned so much. My question is about Jesse Jackson specifically. I know some people think he kind of liberalized over time from his more radical beginnings. Do you agree, or do you think that's a misconception of the complicated nature of organizing within empire?
Um, Jesse Jackson is a really complicated figure because, like, obviously he has a long career in organizing, and actually organized successful campaigns. So, that definitely should not be discounted or taken away from him. But based on like what I've researched so far in his campaign is that he was originally, I wouldn't say hostile, but he was definitely hesitant to more progressive and radical politics. He was not a widely trusted figure within, grassroots organizing, like from the start, because he was always like kind of cozying up to like the liberal elites and the Democratic establishment. Um, and one of the main reasons I believe that his campaigns only went so far is that he really heavily relied on like the civil rights rhetoric that was full of symbolism, but his policy proposals really lacked substance and were not really tangible. Or if they like, not to say they weren't tangible, but he didn't necessarily sufficiently lay out how exactly he would make these things happen. He's going to say like, we're going to give everybody jobs. How? You're going to, you're going to defend the sovereignty of South Africans and Palestinians. How? Like, you're going to make sure women like are getting equal pay, which is great. But like, how are you going to do this? He needs to lay out this in like explicit political agenda. And he kind of failed to do that both times. It's really just like he's a lot of symbolism without substance. I think that would be my biggest critique of his campaigns in 83 and 84 and 88.
Right now, we're all caught up on questions. So let me, the part that I thought really connected a bunch of different things for me was when you said that this was basically the legacy of McCarthyism, that it's ultimately that McCarthyism is kind of what delegitimized radical mobilizing, that, revolutionary progressives would become dead revolutionaries, dead progressives, and how this was kind of this ideological turn, and then it kind of gets reinvigorated through Reagan and the politics of the 1980s, again, with this focus on neoliberalism. So that was, I think, the thing for me that kind of made everything click. Then I also started thinking about, I think some of these other, I guess, Black leaders. And so like W.B. Du Bois, Marcus Garvey, and some of these other people who have, um, I don't want to say like had beef with each other, right? But like there's kind of conflicts and ideological conflicts over like what is kind of the best avenue forward. Is there a certain kind of figure now who's kind of at the helm of some of these, Black progressive movements? Or is there anything else you'd like to kind of comment about kind of this connection between McCarthyism and Reagan?
Man, that's a lot. So I think, well, there's the connection between, I think one connection that we really should make with Reagan is something I discovered like while doing my research is, Reagan's hostility specifically to leftist and progressive or liberal politics at all. He was propped up by the Heritage Foundation, the same the same organization that wrote Project 2025. And he got his start in politics by being informant for the House Committee of Un-American
Yeah.
Activities. And that's a connection that we really need to really look at. Like he built his career off of like criminalizing, snitching, and repressing radical ideas. And he became even more popular through his repression of the Black Panthers in California when he was governor. So I think that thread of Reagan, the Heritage Foundation, we need to be wondering these people that are hostile to these these certain set of politics, who is backing them? And for the last 40 years, it's been the Heritage Foundation. Now that could be my next book after I'm done with my dissertation, but that is something that we should really look at these right-wing conservative think tanks and how powerful they are, who's funding them, and then it just kind of goes down this really deep rabbit hole. You asked another question that I forgot.
I guess maybe current, leaders, but I mean, we don't even need to kind of dip into that yet. I mean, because I found, I think, a lot of parallels, and it seems like the thing that conservatives has done really well is kind of take hold of the language, right? Because even if some of these Black progressives have kind of turned more moderate in order to kind of get white liberals to kind of co-op whatever they're doing, right? So I think there's something, I guess, just really interesting there, because it seems like conservatives have kind of won this war over language and public perception, right? That they're framing, using neoliberalism, they're framing this argument in terms of pull yourselves up by your bootstraps, and we're kind of get rid of handouts and austerity measures and things like that. But I think even something, the $1 Million Hoods Project shows how much we are spending to enact mass incarceration, right? How much of our money is going towards policing just a few neighborhoods. So I think there's the public face of things that they are saying, and then there's things that are going on behind the scenes that are ultimately just about kind of challenging or putting down some of these revolutionary movements and any progressives. So I think I really appreciated the connection that you made there.
Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you. Just there is something that I do want to kind of revisit. There was a slide in my presentation of a picture of Reagan, and I need to share that to kind of really get at this point.
The one where he's making the face?
No, it's on that slide, but it's actually the picture. Oops, the picture above that. It is this picture where he's pointing at talking about your taxes. So Ronald Reagan, prior to Ronald Reagan, there was Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter, during his second run for president, proposed raising the capital gains tax to 36%, which was unheard of. Reagan said, "I'm not going to cut. I'm actually going to cut capital gains taxes and cut just taxes past this tax bracket for in general." But he was immensely skilled at doing this double talk, where he is has this disposition that is friendly to the poor and working class white Americans, but he's not talking to them. He's talking to the donor class, the people that are backing him, the capitalists that are running industries. And so this one, he's talking about the average family income, right? And then he's talking about their bill. He's talking about Jimmy Carter's bill to proposed bill to raise capital gains tax. But this is why we have to really analyze the information that we get from no matter who gives it to us, because Jimmy Carter, like I said, his bill was for capital gains for rich upper class people, but then he's putting this average family income, so that tax bill would not have necessarily been relevant to the average working class person. That's the family that's making $20,000. So to an extent, that is their bill. Their bill is to raise taxes. right? But not for the people that he's saying they're the bill's going to raise taxes for. So he's simultaneously talking to the rich, like, my bill, I'm not going to cut taxes, but in order to gain mass support, I have to throw in this average family income. So the average working class family thinks their taxes are going to go up if I vote for Jimmy Carter, who is problematic as well. But that's beside the point for this argument. But like, but he's not really talking to them, and that's a similar tactic that the current administration did, where I'm gonna lower taxes for you. I'm going to lower the cost of living. I'm going to fix the economy. But in reality, he's going to slash your safety net. He's going to deregulate industry. He's going to bring in foreign investment and try and then transition and then allow and not just the deregulate, but the deregulation is going to send the capital outside of the United States to invest and manufacture abroad. But the people that reap the benefits are the corporations, the rich people that own these corporations that are leaving the U.S. and industrializing in the global South. And yeah, I think that is like something that he is really skillful at, and the current administration was also really successful at, is like this double talk of, making working class people think that he's talking to them when in reality they're not, by like distorting information.
Thank you. Are there other questions from anyone in the audience? Let's see. Angela said, I agree that looking more deeply at Reagan's transition from governor to president could yield much insight to the formation or transition into neoliberalism.
Well, I think that's more so the transition to like more moderate and like conservative stances socially. But I think, and many scholars on the history of capitalism also argue that neoliberalism was like in the process of happening in the decade prior due to stagflation, and they were just trying to get some foreign investment as these corporations and manufacturers left the United States. But like his conservative talk and like the slashing of social safety nets was necessary for neoliberalism to get the short-term profits that they were looking for. So it's a combination of the two.
Then Christian said, we can also look at neoliberalism as a system as opposed to individuals, similarly to the question of fascism.
Yeah, neoliberalism is a system. So yeah, there's individuals that are key in, ensuring that, it's maintained. But, neoliberalism was a system that was in the process of solidifying before Reagan. Reagan was just incredibly effective at making sure that, it actually happened.
And then I think successful in the sense that like many of these programs were created during like the Great Depression, right, as kind of entitlements, in the sense that you as citizens, right, there's certain protections that the government is supposed to afford you and provide you and offer you. However, I think several scholars have noted as kind of like the idea of citizenship has changed over time, and who is, a worthy citizen versus an unworthy citizen. And once that things like that have been racialized, then we begin to consider some people as the unworthy poor or the worthy poor. And so we've kind of moved away from the idea of these programs being there as a benefit for citizens, right? Citizenship is obligations and responsibilities and benefits, right? It's supposed to be a mutually kind of reciprocal relationship, and how we've somehow skewed that to consider some people as undeserving of those benefits and some people as deserving of those benefits.
Right. Yeah, that reminds me of Wendy Brown's book. And she argues that, neoliberalism is not just an economic system, but also this political and intellectual framework that economizes everything. She says we evolved from Homo politicus to Homo economicus, where we've just everything needs a return on investment, and that's kind of leached into the government. And if there's no return of investment on what the government is spending, then it's not worthy of like investing in. And there's instead of for the public good, there's the return of investment. There's this everything, even when we look at ourselves and the career choices we take, and the education that we decide to get, like it's based on this return of investment. And instead of creating like well-informed citizens that are really committed to the public good and trying to build an equitable society for everyone, everything has kind of shifted into like corporatizing everything. We've turned all of our individual selves into corporations, and like we're all these individual brands rather than realizing that we're a part of this system that is doing this to us, rather than and like we need to kind of break away from that. So yeah, I agree.
We have time for a couple more questions if there's anyone else, or else we can, I know other people have things to go to. Well, thank you so much, Broderick, for being our MMUF keynote this research week. I really appreciate you coming here and joining us. And I actually heard we had a very good turnout. I wasn't sure what the normal number of guests was to expect, but it was more than double what that number was. So I'm very happy that we had a good turnout. Thank you all for attending this talk. I really appreciate it, you taking your time and joining us to hear about Broderick and his research and his forthcoming dissertation. So everyone, thank you for attending, and thank you again, Broderick, for joining us today. All right. Have a great
Thank you
day,
so
everyone.
much.
Thank you.